In May of 1945, the Second World War came to an end, leaving behind a devastated landscape. Germany, the engine of the conflict, lay in ruins, its population plunged into chaos and hunger. But for millions of Germans, especially those in Eastern Europe, defeat was only the beginning of a new and brutal chapter. Expelled from their homes, persecuted and subjected to relentless reprisals, they faced a fate marked by violence and loss. The genocide against ethnic Germans was not a spontaneous act, but a systematic process that affected men, women, and children alike. From the massacres in Königsberg to the endless columns of displaced people in East Prussia and Silesia, survivor accounts reveal indescribable suffering. Rapes, executions, and the relentless cold accompanied these communities on their path to exile. This leads us to ask, was the end of the war the beginning of peace for everyone, or did it bring new horrors with it? How strong was this wave of pain and destruction that followed the war? What was left of Germany after the war? The twilight of an empire, Germany in ruins in 1945. In May of 1945, Germany's unconditional surrender marked the end of the Second World War in Europe. However, far from bringing immediate relief, this historic moment brought with it the complete collapse of the Third Reich and the beginning of a period of chaos and suffering for the German population. Entire cities lay in ruins, infrastructure had been destroyed, and millions of civilians were displaced or trapped in war zones. The nation that had been the driving force of the conflict now faced the consequences of its devastating defeat. The collapse of the Nazi regime was not an orderly process. The weeks leading up to the surrender were marked by panic and confusion. Berlin, the political and military heart of Germany, became a symbol of the downfall. The final battle in the capital left the city completely destroyed. More than 80% of its buildings had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombings and intense street fighting between the Red Army and German forces. Photographs taken by Soviet correspondents depict a surreal landscape, streets filled with debris, charred buildings, and civilians wandering with empty stares. The impact on the civilian population was devastating. During the last months of the war, millions of people tried to flee the combat zones, especially in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia. Entire families embarked on a desperate exodus to the west, carrying only what little they could. Soviet archives declassified in the 1990s document how these columns of refugees were frequently attacked by Allied aircraft and ground troops, leaving hundreds dead in their path. A survivor of one of these routes recalled, "It was as if the sky and the earth had turned against us. Every step we took was a risk. Mothers carried their children in their arms, but not all managed to reach the end." At the same time, within German cities, food shortages and the collapse of basic services pushed millions of people to the brink of desperation. Black markets flourished, and many resorted to bartering to obtain essentials. A report from the International Red Cross in 1946 details how, in cities like Hamburg and Dresden, civilians exchanged personal valuables for a piece of bread or a bit of coal. Hunger was not the only enemy. Diseases, exacerbated by the lack of sanitation and overcrowded conditions, spread rapidly. In some cases, typhus and dysentery reached epidemic levels. Hospitals, overwhelmed and poorly equipped, could not treat all the afflicted. A doctor who worked in Berlin after the surrender wrote in his diary, "More and more patients arrived each day. There were women and children who had not eaten in days, their bodies barely able to withstand a minor infection. We felt powerless." Meanwhile, in the areas occupied by the Allies, the treatment of the German population varied significantly. In the east, under the control of the Red Army, reprisals against civilians were frequent. Rapes, looting, and summary executions became a grim reality for thousands of Germans. Although these actions were not officially sanctioned, internal NKVD documents reveal that in many cases, they were tolerated as a form of revenge for Nazi atrocities on Soviet territory. A testimony collected by Polish researchers describes how a woman from Königsberg witnessed the execution of her neighbor, accused without evidence of being a member of the SS. In the West, under American, British, and French administration, policies toward German civilians were somewhat more structured. However, conditions remained harsh. Allied authorities implemented strict restrictions on the movement and activities of the local population while working to dismantle the structures of the Nazi regime. The Germans, many of them demoralized and physically exhausted, also faced the humiliation of living under the occupation of the powers that had defeated their nation. The social chaos was also reflected in a rise in crime within Germany. With the central authority collapsed, thefts, assaults, and other acts of violence skyrocketed. In many cities, Allied forces had to intervene to restore order, although their resources were limited. A British archive from 1945 mentions how, in Hamburg, groups of civilians began forming patrols to protect their neighborhoods, often arming themselves with whatever they could find. Despite these adversities, some signs of hope began to emerge. International organizations such as the Red Cross and the United Nations intervened to distribute humanitarian aid. Food and medicine packages sent from abroad saved many lives, although they were not enough to meet all needs. Photographs from the time show children in Berlin standing in line to receive bread, their faces marked by exhaustion but illuminated by the possibility of a hot meal. The twilight of the Third Reich marked the end of a brutal regime, but it also marked the beginning of a prolonged period of suffering for millions of Germans. The physical and emotional ruins left by the war became the setting for a dark chapter, where the struggle for survival defined every aspect of daily life. Flucht und Vertreibung, the flight and expulsion of millions. After the German capitulation in 1945, one of the largest humanitarian crises in Europe began to unfold. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from their homes in Eastern European territories such as East Prussia, Silesia, and the Sudetenland. This exodus, known as Flucht und Vertreibung, flight and expulsion, represented one of the largest forced displacements in modern history. Ethnic Germans, collectively considered responsible for Nazi crimes, were forced to abandon their homes, facing violence, hunger, and extreme conditions on their journey toward an uncertain future. The planning of these expulsions began even before the war ended. At the Potsdam Conference, held in July of 1945, the Allied powers agreed on the reorganization of European borders, which included the transfer of German territories to Poland and the Soviet Union. This territorial redesign implied the massive relocation of the German populations living in those areas. An official document issued by the Allied forces in Potsdam justified these actions as necessary to ensure future peace in Europe, although it acknowledged that the expulsions should be carried out in an orderly and humane manner. However, the reality was very different. In the territories occupied by the Red Army, expulsions were carried out with brutality and speed. Soviet forces, supported by local militias, stormed villages and cities inhabited by Germans, giving families minimal time to pack their belongings before being forced to leave. A Soviet archive declassified in 1988 details how Germans were loaded into freight train wagons, originally designed to transport livestock, and sent to West Germany on journeys that lasted for weeks. The conditions in these wagons were inhumane. No heating, no proper ventilation, and barely any food or water. The extreme cold of the winter of 1945 and 1946 further worsened the hardships of the displaced. In East Prussia, thousands of people froze to death during the long marches on foot toward the west. Photographs taken by Soviet war correspondents show endless columns of refugees, including children and the elderly, struggling to move forward through the snow. Survivor accounts paint a heartbreaking picture. Greta M., a woman expelled from Silesia with her family, recalled, "My mother carried my little brother in her arms, and I pulled a sled with our belongings. Sometimes we had to leave things behind to keep moving. The cold was unbearable, but if you stopped, you died." In addition to the harsh weather conditions, the displaced faced violence and abuse along their journey. In many cases, refugee trains and columns were attacked by local militias, seeking revenge for the atrocities committed by the Nazis during the occupation. Polish archives found in 1992 describe how some groups organized ambushes to loot the few belongings the Germans carried with them. In East Prussia, cases were documented where refugees were summarily executed by local militias under the accusation of having collaborated with the Nazi regime. German women and girls were particularly vulnerable during this period. Reports of mass rapes committed by soldiers and militiamen are a constant in testimonies from the time. A study conducted by German historians in the 1990s revealed that at least 2 million German women were victims of sexual violence during these expulsions. Although many of these stories remained silent for decades, the accounts that have come to light show the profound psychological and physical impact these experiences left on the survivors. For those who managed to reach their destination in Germany, conditions did not improve significantly. Refugee camps in the West were overcrowded and ill-equipped to handle the massive influx of displaced people. A report by the International Red Cross from 1947 details how, in some camps, families lived in makeshift barracks, sharing cramped spaces with dozens of people. Diseases continued to spread, and malnutrition was common among children and the elderly. The arrival of refugees also generated social tensions in the receiving regions. Local Germans, who were already facing their own challenges in a war-devastated nation, saw the displaced as an additional burden. In some cases, refugees were subjected to discrimination and rejection. A Bavarian government archive mentions that in 1946, residents of a rural village organized protests to prevent the establishment of a refugee camp in their area. Despite these adversities, the displaced slowly began to rebuild their lives. Some found work in agriculture or industry, while others took advantage of educational opportunities that emerged in the following years. However, the trauma of expulsion left an indelible mark on their communities. Memories of losing their homes, suffering during the journey, and struggling to survive in a hostile environment were passed down from generation to generation, becoming an integral part of the identity of the expelled Germans. The expulsion process, although justified at the time as a measure to ensure stability in Europe, resulted in indescribable suffering for millions of people. The documents and testimonies collected over the decades show how political decisions made in conference rooms had devastating consequences on individual lives. This chapter of European history, although less known than other aspects of World War II, remains a reminder of the deep scars left by the conflict. Unleashed vengeance, the massacres in Königsberg, Breslau, and other cities. The fall of the Third Reich in 1945 unleashed a wave of reprisals in Eastern Europe, primarily targeting German civilians. In cities such as Königsberg, Breslau, and other locations that had been under Nazi control, Red Army troops, supported by local militias, carried out acts of vengeance that marked one of the darkest chapters of the war's end. These massacres, steeped in indiscriminate violence, summary executions, and abuse, left deep scars on the affected communities. Königsberg, one of the cultural jewels of East Prussia, witnessed a brutal transformation during the final days of the war. The city, besieged by the Red Army for weeks, finally fell in April of 1945. When Soviet troops entered, they found an exhausted, starving, and desperate civilian population. However, for soldiers who had suffered Nazi atrocities in their own territory, there was no room for compassion. Soviet archives declassified in 1992 detail how mass executions were carried out against men accused, often without evidence, of collaborating with the Nazi regime. A survivor from Königsberg, identified as Helga L., recounted in an interview in the 1950s how she witnessed these reprisals. The men were taken from their homes and lined up in the street. We heard the gunshots from our windows, but we could do nothing. It was not justice, it was extermination. The horror was not limited to executions. The mass rapes committed by Soviet troops were a tactic of terror that affected women of all ages. In Königsberg, it is estimated that tens of thousands of women were victims of sexual violence in the days following the city's capture. A document from the NKVD reveals that these actions, though officially prohibited, were often ignored by senior officers, who saw them as an inevitable consequence of war. The physical and psychological consequences of these acts left indelible marks on the victims, many of whom were never able to speak openly about their experiences. Breslau, another major city in Silesia, suffered a similar fate. For months, the city was the scene of intense fighting as German forces tried to resist the Soviet advance. When it finally fell in May of 1945, reprisals against the civilian population were immediate. Polish archives found in the 1970s document how Soviet troops systematically looted the city, destroying property and executing civilians suspected of being Nazi party members. In one of the most shocking accounts, a family that had sought refuge in a church was dragged outside and publicly executed. A Polish witness who saw the event recounted years later. There was uncontrollable rage in the soldiers. They did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. To them, all Germans were responsible. In both cases, Königsberg and Breslau, reprisals were not exclusive to Soviet troops. Local militias, often composed of civilians who had suffered under Nazi occupation, joined in the acts of violence. These militias, armed with knives, pistols, and improvised weapons, carried out public lynchings and looting, further fueling the chaos. In Königsberg, an archive discovered in 1995 describes how a group of militiamen burned a German merchant alive, accusing him of having denounced his neighbors during the Nazi regime. In other locations, such as Nemmersdorf in East Prussia, the massacres reached an even greater scale. Nemmersdorf was one of the first German villages captured by the Red Army in October of 1944, and the atrocities committed there became a symbol of the terror to come. Testimonies from eyewitnesses and photographs taken by German soldiers show dozens of civilians, including children and the elderly, executed summarily. Although the exact circumstances of these massacres remain a subject of historical debate, evidence suggests that the acts of violence were widespread and deliberate. The psychological impact of these massacres was devastating for the survivors. Many, faced with unbearable trauma, chose silence, while others attempted to rebuild their lives amid the devastation. A psychological report from 1948 details how women who had suffered mass rapes in Königsberg developed high levels of depression and anxiety disorders, while children who witnessed the executions showed signs of severe post-traumatic stress. Despite the magnitude of these events, official documentation was limited. The Allied powers, concerned with maintaining post-war stability, downplayed reports of the massacres and abuses. However, in later years, survivor testimonies and declassified archives began to shed light on the scale of the reprisals. A German archive found in 1987 contained a list of more than 10,000 names of civilians who disappeared during the reprisals in East Prussia, many of whom were never found. The legacy of these massacres is a grim reminder that the end of the war did not bring peace for everyone. For Germans in Königsberg, Breslau, and other eastern cities, defeat meant a new phase of suffering that continued to mark entire generations. Collective punishment, the doctrine of German responsibility. The doctrine of collective punishment applied to Germans after the Second World War was based on the idea that the entire population was responsible, to a greater or lesser extent, for the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. This perspective was not only promoted by the Allied powers, but was also widely accepted by the nations that had suffered under German occupation. From mass expulsions to forced labor and direct reprisals, this doctrine shaped post-war policies and left a legacy of suffering that affected millions of people. In the agreements reached during the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, the Allied powers discussed how to handle Germany's collapse. In addition to territorial division and demilitarization, they also addressed the issue of German responsibility. An official document issued after the conference established that Germans were to be held accountable for the war crimes and atrocities perpetrated during the Nazi occupation. Although this approach was initially intended for the regime's leaders, it soon expanded to include the entire German population, especially in the zones occupied by the Soviet Union and Poland. In the Eastern territories, the doctrine of collective responsibility was applied particularly harshly. The mass expulsions of ethnic Germans from East Prussia, Silesia, and the Sudetenland were not only seen as a security measure, but also as punishment for the crimes of the Third Reich. Polish archives, declassified in 1991, reveal that local authorities justified these expulsions as a way to cleanse their territories of any German influence and ensure they would never again be used as a platform for aggression. In many cases, this logic translated into acts of indiscriminate violence against German civilians. A report from the NKVD dated September of 1945 describes how Soviet troops, upon occupying villages in Silesia, carried out mass arrests and deportations based solely on the residents' nationality. Men were sent to forced labor, while women and children were evicted from their homes without prior notice. These displacements, carried out without consideration for weather conditions or the health of the expelled, resulted in thousands of deaths due to hunger, cold, and disease. The concept of collective responsibility was also used to justify the forced labor imposed on millions of Germans after the war. In the Soviet Union, tens of thousands of German civilians were sent to gulags and labor camps in remote regions. These people, many of them with no direct connection to the Nazi regime, were forced to perform exhausting tasks under brutal conditions. A Soviet archive declassified in 1994 details how entire groups of men and women were transported from Königsberg to Siberia to work in road construction and coal mines. Mortality rates in these camps were alarming, with some reports indicating that more than 30% of prisoners died within the first 2 years. The impact of this policy was especially evident in ethnic German communities living outside the borders of the Reich. In the Sudetenland, for example, more than 2 million Germans were expelled from their homes after the war. The Czechoslovak authorities, backed by the Potsdam Agreements, carried out these expulsions systematically. In some cases, residents were forced to leave with only a few hours' notice, leaving behind all their possessions. A testimony collected in the 1950s describes how a Sudeten family was forced to abandon their home under threat of execution. "They gave us 1 hour to pack. The soldiers took us to the edge of the village and told us never to return. We left everything, even the photos of our grandparents. It was as if we had never existed." In Poland, the narrative of collective responsibility was used to justify the seizure of German properties. A government decree issued in 1945 allowed for the expropriation of land and goods from anyone identified as German, regardless of their connection to the Nazi regime. These properties were redistributed among Poles who had been displaced by the war, creating tensions between local communities and the remaining Germans. The treatment of German prisoners of war also reflected the doctrine of collective punishment. Although international conventions guaranteed certain rights to prisoners, in many cases these rules were ignored. In Soviet camps, prisoners were subjected to brutal interrogations and forced labor with few resources for survival. A report from the NKVD mentions that in some camps, prisoners were used as examples to discipline others, facing severe physical punishments for minor infractions. The ideological justification behind these policies was deeply rooted in the trauma caused by Nazi atrocities. The nations that had suffered under German occupation saw these reprisals as a form of historical justice. However, for the German civilians who became the target of these policies, the impact was devastating. A report from the International Red Cross in 1946 details how displaced Germans in refugee camps faced extreme conditions with high rates of malnutrition and disease. Despite these hardships, the official narrative in many countries justified these actions as necessary to ensure post-war stability. The Allied leaders, aware of international criticism, often downplayed reports of abuses and focused on the achievements of reconstruction. However, declassified archives and victims' testimonies began to shed light on the true dimensions of this policy, challenging official narratives. The doctrine of collective punishment left a complex legacy. While it was seen as a form of retribution for the crimes of the Third Reich, it also resulted in massive suffering for millions of people who had no direct connection to the events that led to the war. For the Germans who survived this era, the physical and emotional scars were deep, and the stories of these experiences were passed down from generation to generation, ensuring that these events would not be forgotten. The shadows of the Gulag, Germans in forced labor camps. With the German surrender in 1945, the Soviet Union faced the task of rebuilding a country devastated by war. To achieve this, it turned to a source of labor that it considered both a resource and a punishment: the captured German civilians and prisoners of war. Tens of thousands of men, women, and teenagers were sent to the gulags, the vast Soviet forced labor camp system, where inhumane conditions and exploitation became their new reality. The transport of these prisoners began shortly after the German capitulation. NKVD documents, declassified in 1991, show that thousands of civilians were arrested in territories occupied by the Red Army and labeled as potential collaborators or reassignable workers. Many of these individuals had no ties to the Nazi regime, but their nationality and usefulness as labor made them targets. From Königsberg, Silesia, and East Prussia, they were transported in freight train wagons to remote regions of Siberia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. The journeys could last for weeks, and the wagons lacked ventilation, heating, and basic resources. A testimony from a German prisoner captured in Königsberg describes the conditions of one of these transfers. They packed us into wagons as if we were cattle. There was barely any room to move, and the air became unbreathable. Most of us had no idea where we were being taken. We only knew that the journey was endless. Upon arrival at the gulags, prisoners were subjected to a strict registration process. Their belongings were confiscated. They were assigned a number, and they were provided with worn-out clothing inadequate for the extreme climatic conditions. The barracks where they lived were made of uninsulated wood, offering little protection against freezing temperatures. During winters, the extreme cold combined with the lack of food and proper clothing made diseases common and often fatal. The daily labor was exhausting and designed to maximize production without regard for the prisoners' well-being. In the Siberian gulags, many Germans worked in coal and metal mines, digging tunnels in dangerous conditions without safety equipment. Others were sent to cut down forests in densely wooded regions, facing 14-hour shifts with rudimentary tools. An NKVD report from 1947 recorded at least 500 deaths in a single camp due to work-related accidents. Hunger was a constant in the prisoners' daily lives. Rations consisted of black bread, watery soup, and occasionally dried fish. These portions were insufficient to sustain men and women performing intense physical labor, leading to severe malnutrition. A Soviet archive mentions that prisoners who failed to meet daily work quotas were punished with a reduction in rations, creating a deadly cycle of weakness and punishment. In some camps, German prisoners became victims of experiments with new forms of labor exploitation. A report discovered in 1988 details how tests were conducted in certain gulags to determine the physical limits of forced workers. These practices included the gradual increase of work quotas and the simultaneous reduction of rations, leading to a high mortality rate. Despite the extreme conditions, some prisoners managed to resist and survive through ingenuity and solidarity. Clandestine networks were formed within the camps, where prisoners shared food, survival tips, and even medicine. In one of the gulags in Kazakhstan, a group of German prisoners organized an internal bartering system, using small personal objects as currency to obtain extra food or warm clothing. Surveillance in the gulags was strict, and escape attempts were severely punished. A report from a camp in Siberia describes how, in 1946, a group of 6 German prisoners attempted to escape by crossing the forest in the middle of winter. They were captured a few kilometers from the camp and publicly executed as a warning to the others. A witness to this event recounted, "They placed them in front of us and shot them without warning. They wanted us to understand that there was no escape." In addition to forced labor, prisoners were subjected to periodic interrogations. Soviet authorities sought to obtain information about Nazi operations, war crimes, and possible conspiracies. These interrogations were often conducted under torture, using methods that included sleep deprivation, beatings, and exposure to the cold. In a testimony collected by German historians, a prisoner described how he was forced to stand barefoot on snow for hours while being interrogated. With Stalin's death in 1953, the situation in the gulags began to change slowly. The de-Stalinization policies implemented by Nikita Khrushchev led to the gradual release of many prisoners, including Germans. However, by then, thousands had already died, and the survivors returned home physically and emotionally scarred by their experience. The archives and testimonies of German prisoners in the gulags offer a shocking account of how Soviet policies used forced labor as a tool for punishment and reconstruction. For those who lived through this experience, the memory of the years in the camps became a symbol of the brutality of the post-war period and a reminder of the moral complexities of a world seeking justice after the most devastating conflict in history. Lost territories. The transformation of Eastern Europe. The end of World War II brought a profound transformation to the map of Eastern Europe. The mass expulsions of ethnic Germans, the forced resettlement of populations, and the territorial reorganization redrew borders, eliminating the German cultural and human legacy that had existed for centuries in many regions. This process, although promoted as a measure to ensure future peace, had an incalculable human and cultural cost. In the agreements reached during the Potsdam Conference in 1945, the Allied powers decided to transfer large stretches of German territory to Poland and the Soviet Union. East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia were divided between these two countries, while the Sudetenland became part of Czechoslovakia. To consolidate this new territorial distribution, the German populations residing in these areas were systematically expelled. A report issued by the Polish government in 1946 justified these actions as a way to ensure that the German threat would not resurface in the future. In East Prussia, a region that had been a German cultural and political center for centuries, the transformation was immediate and radical. Known for its picturesque landscapes and rich history, this region was divided between Poland and the Soviet Union. Königsberg, the former capital, was renamed Kaliningrad and fully Sovietized. Soviet archives declassified in the 1990s revealed that the authorities carried out a deliberate campaign to erase any trace of the German past, from the destruction of historical monuments to the forced relocation of the few remaining Germans. In one of these documents, a Soviet officer wrote, "Kaliningrad must be a symbol of the new order. There is no place for the ruins of fascism here." The cities that had once been the heart of German culture became enclaves of new national identities. In Silesia, Breslau was renamed Rakowa and repopulated with Poles displaced from eastern territories that Poland lost to the Soviet Union. This massive population exchange created a tense dynamic, as many of the newcomers struggled to adapt to an unfamiliar environment, while traces of the expelled German population remained. A Polish report from 1947 mentions how the names of streets, churches, and German cemeteries were changed or destroyed in an effort to erase the memory of the past. In the Sudetenland, the expulsion of ethnic Germans was particularly systematic. This mountainous region, home to more than 3 million Germans before the war, was completely depopulated within a few years. The abandoned properties were confiscated by the Czechoslovak state and redistributed among the new residents. However, many of these buildings, including farms and factories, fell into ruins due to the lack of experience of the new occupants in maintaining them. A testimony collected in the 1950s by a Czechoslovak historian describes how a Polish family, newly arrived in the Sudetenland, struggled to adapt to an environment they considered foreign. Everything here seemed marked by those who had lived before. It was as if the Germans were still present, even though they had disappeared. The cultural disappearance of German communities in Eastern Europe was perhaps one of the most tragic aspects of this transformation. For centuries, these communities had contributed significantly to architecture, music, literature, and local traditions. With their expulsion, a legacy that had been an integral part of European history was lost. In Königsberg, for example, the cathedral, which had survived centuries of wars and political changes, was severely damaged during the bombings and left abandoned for decades until it was finally restored in the 1980s, not as a German symbol, but as a Soviet monument. In addition to cultural and territorial changes, the human impact of these transformations was immense. The expelled Germans faced not only the loss of their homes, but also the trauma of being uprooted from lands where they had lived for generations. Many died during the forced transfers, while others spent years in refugee camps in West Germany, facing discrimination and poverty. A report by the International Red Cross from 1948 details how thousands of German children in these camps suffered from malnutrition and diseases, while their parents struggled to find work and rebuild their lives. The impact of these expulsions was not limited to the Germans. The nations that received the territories also faced significant challenges. In Poland, the repopulation of East Prussia and Silesia was a chaotic process, as the newcomers lacked experience in local agriculture and industry. Polish archives mention how many villages were abandoned due to the inability of the new residents to adapt. In Czechoslovakia, the disappearance of ethnic Germans left an economic and social void, especially in rural regions. Despite efforts to erase the German past, traces of this history remain visible in many parts of Eastern Europe. In Kaliningrad, the remnants of Prussian fortresses and forgotten cemeteries serve as silent witnesses to the German presence that once dominated the region. In Rakwa, the Gothic-style churches and buildings remain as reminders of its past as Breslau. Even in the Sudetenland, the ruins of abandoned German villages tell the story of a community that disappeared in a matter of years. The transformation of Eastern Europe after World War II was a complex process that left a lasting impact on the people and places affected. Memory and silence, the hidden history of the German victims. The history of the German victims after the Second World War has been, for decades, an uncomfortable and largely silenced topic. While the crimes of the Nazi regime took center stage in the global collective memory, the experiences of millions of Germans who suffered displacement, reprisals, and abuse were relegated to oblivion. The predominant narrative, focused on justice for those affected by Nazism, left little room to acknowledge the suffering of those who, although German, did not directly participate in the regime's crimes. After the war, the testimonies of the displaced and survivors of reprisals were met with indifference or rejection. In Western Germany, the focus was on reconstruction and distancing from the Nazi past, while in Eastern Germany, under Soviet influence, official narratives minimized German suffering in favor of highlighting Nazi atrocities against other nations. Declassified archives in the 1980s revealed that the authorities of the GDR considered the recognition of German victims a threat to the socialist narrative that justified the actions of the Red Army in Eastern Europe. The imposed silence was not only political but also social. In many cases, the survivors themselves chose not to speak about their experiences. For women who suffered sexual violence, the stigma was insurmountable. A study conducted in the 1990s documents how numerous survivors never shared their stories, even with their families, for fear of rejection. A woman, identified as Marta G., recounted in her final years, "I preferred to remain silent. I did not want my children to look at me with pity or feel ashamed of what was done to me." In the years following German reunification, a slow process of recognition began. Documentaries, books, and exhibitions publicly addressed for the first time the suffering of displaced Germans and victims of reprisals. However, this recognition was met with criticism from some sectors, who argued that focusing attention on these victims could dilute the severity of Nazi crimes. Recently declassified archives in Poland show that even in the 2000s there was resistance to allowing investigations into the mass displacements in Silesia and East Prussia. Despite these obstacles, the memory of the German victims began to take shape. Associations of displaced persons and survivors managed to create memorials and promote academic research documenting their communities' experiences. In Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, a small monument commemorates the German inhabitants who died during the evacuation and reprisals. In the Sudetenland, the ruins of abandoned churches and cemeteries have been restored as historical sites, preserving the memory of a vanished community. The history of these victims remains a controversial topic, but its recognition is essential to understanding the complexity of the events that followed the conflict. Beyond simplified narratives, these accounts offer a nuanced perspective on how the war and its aftermath affected everyone, regardless of their nationality or political affiliation. The genocide and reprisals against Germans after the Second World War represent a dark and lesser-known chapter in European history. Millions of civilians, whose only connection to the Third Reich was their nationality, suffered displacement, abuse, and the complete loss of their homes. These events, although justified at the time as security measures and historical reparation, left a mark of suffering that affected entire generations. The recognition of these victims has been a slow process, hindered by political and social narratives that prioritized other agendas. However, their memory is essential to understanding the magnitude of the human impact of the war. Forced displacements, massacres, and reprisals not only redefined Europe's borders, but also permanently altered the cultural and social fabric of entire regions. This account reminds us that, even in moments of justice, there is a danger of crossing the thin line into vengeance. Reflecting on these events does not seek to justify the actions of the Nazi regime, but to ensure that the lessons of the past guide us toward a future where human suffering is never ignored or repeated.